that, though, I want to mention, last week we did Nehemiah, and I really enjoy studying Nehemiah. I used to teach a class called Roadmap to Problem Solving, and I used Nehemiah. And there are 5 things that emerge in that story. If you remember, they were able to build the walls of Jerusalem in 52 days, and it took 60 years. For 60 years, they weren't able to build that wall. And Nehemiah, under his leadership, in 52 days, they got it done. Well, here's the procedure. Number 1, you identify a need, and they did that. They identified the problem. You're really not, in the ancient times, you're not a city if you don't have walls to protect you. Number 2, they came up with a plan. They have a simple plan. The families would each be assigned a section of the wall, and as they built the wall, they would have their instruments they were using to build with, plus their weapons to fight off enemies. Third, they put their plan into action, and action is important. It's one thing to come up with a plan, but it's quite different to put that plan into action. Without action, plan is useless. Number 3, they delegated responsibility. In the wilderness, it was Moses' father-in-law told him, you can't do what you're doing. So you have to delegate responsibility. And that's exactly what Nehemiah did. And then the thing that I think is remarkable, one of the best lessons you can see in Nehemiah's story, is Nehemiah works alongside the people until the job is done. He doesn't use this as an opportunity to amass personal wealth. Public service should be about serving the public, not serving self. Nehemiah is an excellent example of that. So they were able to get the job done. I want to look at the concept of kings in the ancient Near East, and then we'll go into a little bit of history about the Persians. The great king is used in the Bible to describe the king of Assyria. It is the Assyrian word saru, which means king, and rabu, which means great. The Assyrian kings had many different names that they went by. The Sumerian king, and I think I said this last time when we were teaching, was called Lugal. Lu meaning man and Gal meaning big, so he was the big man. At the kings had the designation Dingir, Dingir, which meant, that went before their name, and it meant that they were God. Amazing. The Hittite word for king is Hasu, which means to be powerful. The name for the king in Babylon is Sar, S-A-R. And it can mean king, it can mean prince, it can mean leader, it can mean captain, it can be official or a head person. That's what that designates. The Median king was called Madda. The Elamite king was called Sun-Ki. In Egypt, the king was, and I'll spell this word for you, it's Nebty, N-E-B-T-Y, and it means the 2 ladies, or the uniting of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom under one leader. Or he could be referred to as, it would be Per-ah, from which we get the word Pharaoh, and it means the person who lives in a great house. Now, the Persian king went by the name Shah. Or he could be called King of Kings, would be Shah-an-Shah. Or he could be called Lord King, Padshah. So the Bible speaks about a lot of kings and their roles in leading people. It shows that kings have great power, but with that comes responsibility and accountability. The Bible highlights that kings should be wise and fair, always thinking about what is good for their people. It warns that when kings are selfish and turn away from honoring God's commands, they bring trouble on the land. And that's why I think I gave this reference last week. I want to give it again. Micah 6:8. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God. Now that applies to the kings of Israel, but there's a broader application for all of us. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God. And I think there's a much broader application in terms of leadership in general. That's what you want in a leader. You want a leader who is just. You want a leader who is merciful, and you also want a leader who is humble. That's why it shouldn't surprise us when Daniel 2:21 says, speaking of God, he changes times and seasons. He removes kings and he sets up kings. Now, we've got many examples in the Bible of God working with kings. One of the first ones is Joseph. If you remember, Joseph interpreted the dream of Pharaoh, and then he was given a preeminent position in Pharaoh's court. You read about in Genesis chapter 41. And this takes place around circa, and I use the term circa, meaning we're not nailing it down to a specific time, but a time frame. So it would be circa 1780 BC. Then we have Moses before Pharaoh and the 10 plagues. That takes place around circa 1446 BC, right before the Exodus. Moses was a prince in Egypt. He was raised to be a pharaoh. God was preparing him to be the shepherd, of course, for Israel. Then you have the story of Jonah. And Jonah goes to preach to Nineveh. And about 140 years later, Nahum preaches to Nineveh as well. But they don't get the message. So there is a short-lived repentance that we read about in the story of Jonah, but it's only short-lived. We don't know who the king was at the time of Jonah. In Jonah 3:6, the king's name remains anonymous. But we do know this, that it had to take place before the time of Tiglath-Pileser, which would be 745 B.C., and it might fit the reign of Adad-Nidari II, 810 to 783, but we don't know. It may also be, this is before Nineveh becomes a royal city. So it just may be that you have the king of a city that's not the royal city at this time, okay? You have Daniel interpreting the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king. In Daniel 2, that would be circa 605 to 562 BC. And then there's the humbling of Nebuchadnezzar that we read about in Daniel chapter 4. And if you remember, Nebuchadnezzar he built a golden statue of himself that was 90 foot tall. By the way, fast forward in history, somebody else does that. Only his statue is 99 feet tall, and that's Nero. It's also a golden statue. But Nebuchadnezzar was humbled by God, and after he was humbled, he said, I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride, he is able to humble, and he is a classic example of that. So what does the Bible say about humbling and humility? Humility goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before the fall. Okay, that brings us to Belshazzar. And this is, Belshazzar is celebrating with his nobles, and he sees the handwriting on the wall, which says your kingdom has been weighed and found wanting. It's going to be delivered over to the Medes and the Persians, and that takes place around circa 539 BC, which leads to the rise of Cyrus as the first real king of Persia. And that takes place around 600 to 576 BC, and we read about the declaration of Cyrus in chapter 1 of Ezra. That brings us to Xerxes I. Xerxes saves the Jewish people. He intervenes on behalf of the Jews with Esther. That's circa 486 to 456 BC. Then you have Artaxerxes I. That's it. You read about Artaxerxes in Ezra, and you read about Artaxerxes in Nehemiah. Now, what I'm going to show you is how that all fits together, where these guys come into play. So, who were the Persians? Where did the Persians come from? What do Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther have in common? One word: Persia. Where do we find modern-day Persia today? Iran, absolutely. And I'll show you how you come to that name. In the Bronze Age, around circa 3300 to 1200 BC, people speaking a Proto-Indo-Iranian language lived primarily in what is now Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan. Some Indo-Indian tribes extended as far east as China, Xinjiang province, and as far south as the Indian subcontinent. The people themselves were called Aryan, A-R-Y-A-N, which means, anybody know what it means? It means noble or free. It's the root from which we get the name Iran from, okay? A mass movement of these Iranian tribes called the Aryan migration split into three groups in the late second millennium BC. One group remained in the core Aryan region or migrated slightly south following the Oxus River. They formed the Bactrian and Sogdian tribes north of the Hindu Kush Mountains in today's Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. The second group, the Aryans, headed south to the strip of plains lying between the mountains of Iran and Afghanistan. The third wave of Indo-Iranians swept into the Iranian plateau. They first arrived around 1100 BC, forming the Median Kingdom. And by the way, Cyrus is both Median and Persian. They're kissing cousins, okay? We don't know why they left Central Asia, this area and group. It was probably from overgrazing. They were primarily nomadic. And also something else might have happened. Anybody want to hazard a guess what that is? Because you see this all over the ancient world. Why different tribes are migrating to another area? There's pressure from other tribes. Classic example, I say this name, it comes to everybody reckon, the Mongols. The Mongols put a lot of pressure on different tribes and pushed them further east. But you also see that with the Huns. You see that with the Turks. You see that with the Goths. They're all different tribal groups. They were dispossessed from one land and forced to migrate to a different land. Now, it may be that it was a result of tribal pressure, or it may be that it was a result of using up the grazing territory. It may be what we would refer to as climate change, which is natural. The basis for climate change is Genesis 3, the fall, and Genesis 6, the flood, and the climatic things that took place thereafter. In fact, Paul argues in Romans 8, the earth groans for restoration of what has once been lost. Now, with changing climate, and that happens naturally, as a result of the flood, nomadic tribes were forced to move from one area, causing upheaval in the lands where they settled. The Hittites, an early power in ancient Near East, were forced to move out of Asia Minor because of severe drought conditions. But we see the same thing happening in the United States. In the Americas, there was a tribal group in America called the Mississippi Indian population, which they had a huge city called Cahokia, close to what is now St. Louis. And they were forced to abandon that city as climate change. We see it in the Southwest as well, among some of the I don't know if you've ever been to see some of the Indian dwellings in the Southwest, the cliff dwellings. Have you been to those places? Why did they leave those places? They don't know. Probably a change in climate, okay? So it's not anything new. We see it all over the world, okay? So the shift from a nomadic lifestyle to town dwellers led to clashes and power plays as city-states vied for agricultural land and dominion over surrounding towns. Now, although the Persians shared a common ethnicity, language, and culture, they never united as one kingdom until much later under the leadership of Cyrus the Great. Here's something interesting, too. Do you know the Iranians still celebrate Cyrus the Great today? Which I find fascinating, okay? So, instead, Persia suffered an era of chaos as the chieftains fought their rivals for divine right of kings to rule, which they believed came from their Indo-Iranian god. Okay, so while the Persians grew in strength and numbers in the southern Iraq, their distant relatives, the Medes in the north, were also thriving, especially once the Assyrian Empire began to unravel. So that brings us to Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great's grandfather was a Median king by the name of Astyages. Cyrus learned how to wage war by studying his grandfather. Cyrus ascended to the throne in 559 BC with the title King of Anshan. Now, here's what the Persian stories tell about Cyrus. It says, and you wonder who writes this, okay? It says that he was handsome, he was generous, he was respectful, he was idealistic, he was courteous, and eager to learn new things. Does that sound like a little propaganda to you? Does it sound like Cyrus had a hand in writing that stuff about himself? Okay, now, Herodotus says that he was hawk-nosed, which the Persians found to be very attractive. So there's hope for you and me and John. Herodotus also said that he had an unnerving, piercing gaze. There was conflict between Cyrus and his grandfather. Astyages got his troops together, was going to make war on Cyrus, and guess what happened? His troops imprisoned him and went over to Cyrus, and Cyrus then emerged as king. Cyrus the Great was the founder of the Achaemenid Empire. He was born sometime around 590 to 580 BC in either Media or Paris. In the Bible, Cyrus is described as how by Isaiah. What does Isaiah say about Cyrus? Cyrus my servant. Why is that? Because God was going to use Cyrus to do what? Absolutely. He was going to use Cyrus to deliver the Jewish captives from captivity under the Babylonians. Now, there is a consistent story that you see in the ancient Near East, and that is one empire will fall and another will arise to take its place. Okay? In the conquest of Babylon, Cyrus' general Gubaru had his engineers divert the Euphrates River into nearby canals, thus giving the Achaemenid army access to Babylon. In Babylon at the time, there was drunken partying going on, which we read about in Daniel, which obscured the noise of Cyrus's troops breaking down the Enlil Gate, which allowed the Persians to enter in force. And the Babylonians were too drunk to defend themselves, and the rest is history. 2 weeks later, Cyrus rode into Babylon and took control. Now, it's suggested that Cyrus may have read the prophecies of Isaiah that was written before Cyrus's birth. This is what it says. This is from Isaiah. This is what the Lord says to Cyrus, his anointed, whose right hand I have grasped to subdue nations before him, disarm kings and open doors before him, so that the gates will not be shut. I will go before you and level the mountains. I will break down the gate of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. I will give you treasure of darkness and riches hidden in secret places, so that you may know that I am the Lord, the God of Israel, who calls you. Josephus says in his history that Cyrus actually read that account. Now, whether that happened or not, I don't know. Is that plausible? I think it is. It's plausible from the standpoint of Proverbs 21:1 says, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wills. Or Psalm 75:7. But it is God who executes judgment, putting down one and lifting up another. So it is God who is operating in human history, and it is God who brings up the Babylonian Empire to take down the Syrian Empire, and brings up the Persian Empire to take down the Babylonians, and then the Greeks and the Romans, and so on and so on. But God is the one who's moving behind human history, so that what takes place is not coincidental, it is not accidental, it is by the hand of Almighty God. So let's look at the Persian kings and see how Xerxes fits into this. Cyrus reigns from about 550 to 529 BC. He's followed to the throne by his son Cambyses, 529 to 522 BC. Cambyses' son, Badria, rules for a very short time in 522 BC, and something happens, and we don't know exactly what it is. But a man by the name of Darius the Great takes the throne. Darius had been, his responsibility was he held the spear for Cambyses. That was kind of his official title. So there has to be a lot of intrigue and stuff going on behind the scenes that removes Badria and places Darius in as the king of Persia. He's followed to the throne by his son Artaxerxes I of Ezra and Nehemiah, and that's 465 to 425 BC. So that when we look at the story of Esther, we're actually going back in time a little bit. With Nehemiah and Ezra, it is, who's the king at that time? I've already mentioned it, but who's the king at that time? Artaxerxes the first. And Xerxes is his dad. So now when we look at Esther, we're looking at Artaxerxes' dad. Okay, so let's get into the book. I do want to mention this. Critical scholars see both the books of Jonah and Esther, are you ready for this, as works of fiction. Why? I don't agree with them, by the way. Let me get out in front on that. Why do they say they're works of fiction? There is a supernatural element involved, and their presupposition does not allow for supernatural. They believe in a closed universe, so they can't see the miraculous taking place. And you can see God's hand miraculously working in Jonah. You can see it in Ezra and Nehemiah, and you can see it in Esther as well. So, chapter 1. Xerxes hosting a huge party, and it mentions that it's at Shushan, which is also named Susa, or Persepolis. It's got all three names. The queen is summoned to come before the king to celebrate this great party. And what happens? Vashti decides she's not in a party mood. So she decides not to show up. Is that a problem for King Xerxes? Absolutely. Verse 17. For the queen's behavior will be made known to, listen, I love this. The queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. Now, remember, this is a patriarchal and a tribal society. What you don't want to do in a patriarchal society is not honor the father figure, not honor the king. And that's exactly what happens. Verse 18 says, this very day, the noble women of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. Modern translation, and mama isn't happy, so nobody's happy. Okay? You might see this as a very early forerunner of the women's rights movement. Okay? However, Vashti then would be removed from her position as queen, and she would never be allowed to come before the king again. We don't know what happens to her, but we know that she's removed as queen. Yes? Yeah. Very often in the Bible you have different names for people. Ahasuerus is also Xerxes the first. Okay? So, chapter 2. Young virgins are sought to replace the rejected queen. Esther is selected to become queen. Mordecai, an official of the Persian court, foils a plot against the king. So let's look at the elements there. Many of the officials who served closest to the kings were eunuchs. Why is that? Yeah, they're not a threat. The official who's going to be in charge of the harem will be a eunuch. Okay? That is to preserve the bloodline. Okay? Mordecai is introduced as the son of Shimei, the son of Kish. He's a Benjamite. Here again, you see the importance of genealogy. Why is genealogy so important? And there's a really practical reason here. What? It's going to be important because of Jesus. From a practical standpoint, though, long before Jesus comes, there's a very practical reason why genealogy is important. It has to do with inheriting the land. So they want to make sure the land belongs to the proper tribal family. So that's the idea behind that. It says that Mordecai was carried away as a captive with Jeconiah, king of Judah, as part of the Babylonian captivity. This means it would have taken place somewhere around 597 BC. He is one of the captives taken into captivity. So he has the unique position of remembering what it was like before Israel goes into captivity. Mordecai had the responsibility for raising Esther, Hadassah, the daughter of his uncle. When Esther's father died, Mordecai took Esther as his own daughter. Esther in verse 7 is described this way. She is a young woman who had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. Okay, Persian kings were looking for a woman with a nice personality. That's what that tells you. Okay? Chapter 3. Haman is promoted to prime minister. In spite of Haman's command, Mordecai refuses to kneel and honor Haman. In his rage, Haman seeks to destroy not only Mordecai, but all the Jews. And the king approves of Haman's plan and sets a date for the execution of the plan as the 13th of Adar. Now, who is Haman? The Bible describes him as an Agagite. So, what does that mean? He's a descendant of an Amalekite king by the name of Agag. Anybody remember that story? Okay. What was Haman's motive? I'm going to get into it in a moment. What was Haman's motive in plotting against the Jews? Apparently, this was part of a long-standing hatred that Haman had against the Jewish people. Now, the Amalekites were longtime enemies of Israel. You can read about this in 1 Samuel chapter 15, God told Saul to destroy the Amalekites. What did Saul do? He didn't do that. In fact, he didn't destroy Agag, the king. And what did they do with the things of value? They kept that stuff, and then when Saul was confronted by the prophet about what he's done, remember what Saul's response was? Hey, I did this so I could offer a sacrifice to the Lord. Lame excuse. He was caught with his hand in the cookie jar, and that was his lame excuse for it, okay? In Deuteronomy 25:17-19 says, remember what Amalek, the Amalekites, did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary and cut off your tail, that is, the people lagging behind. Cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind you, and he did not fear God. So the Amalekites, as the children of Israel were coming through the wilderness, they wanted to pass through the Amalekites' land, and the Amalekites made war against them. The Amalekites were basically a nomadic people as well. So, now that brings up, I think, one other thing, and this is Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 through 16. There was a battle fought with the Amalekites at Rephidim. Anybody remember the story? When Moses lifts up his hands, the Jews prevail. When Moses' hands go down, the Amalekites prevail. And so Aaron and Hur have to hold Moses' arms up in the air, okay? And then verse 13 says, Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with a sword. Now that brings up a larger question that I think you have to deal with. Why anti-Semitism? Why do we see this unreasonable historical hatred toward the Jews? And I would suggest historically they were known as what kind of people? God's chosen people. Okay, good. I think a key to understanding what is happening is found in Psalms 2, verses 1 and 2, when it says this, why did the nations rage and people plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves against the Lord and against the Lord's anointed. The kings of the earth set themselves against the Lord. So that anti-Semitism, I really believe, is demonic. It is fallen man hates both the concept of God and the fact that God has operated historically among certain sets of people, i.e. Jews and Christians. Because the same people that hate the Jews, don't kid yourself, hate Christians as well. And I think we have to understand that. That's the only logical explanation for this anti-Semitism movement. So, I think it also points to what Paul speaks about in Romans 1:18 and 19 when he says, it is part of the wrath of God being revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God had shown it to them, and they don't like it. Or John 3:19, and this is the judgment, light has come into the world, but men love darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. So why anti-Semitism? The hatred isn't so much toward the Jews as it's toward who? God. They don't like the fact of a creator God. Why? Because if there is a creator God, then they have to submit. They don't want to do that. That's what it's all about. That brings us to chapter 4. Mordecai and the Jews mourn over Haman's edict. Mordecai gave a copy to Esther to seek her help in thwarting Haman's plan. Esther asked Mordecai and the Jews, as well as her own maidservants, to fast for 3 full days. Now, what's the idea behind fasting? Why do you fast, typically? What's the purpose of fasting? Lose weight? No. Although it works. What's the purpose of fasting? Yeah, there's something associated with fasting, and that's prayer. So it's prayer and fasting. You are seeking God's favor for something that's going on in your life. And you demonstrate the seriousness of that by exhibiting it in a time of prayer and fasting. So that's what Esther does. Now, the Persian kings at Persepolis, at Susa, would have a long staff or a golden scepter in his right hand. By the way, every time you see images of the king at Persepolis, you'll see the king with this long staff, okay? It's important. To enter into the king's presence without being summoned was to risk the penalty of death. So that when you entered into the presence of the king of Persia, he would lower his staff, indicating that you could approach him. If he doesn't lower the staff, what does that mean? You're in big trouble. Absolutely. Okay. So the palace has two courts. There's an outer court and inner court. You see this in chapter 6, verse 4. The king would be in the inner court. So this decree was to maintain two things, both majesty of the king, honoring him as king, but something else very important. What is that? It's protecting him. Because there's always a possibility of assassination. In fact, you can read all about that in the ancient world. I was reading today in Assyria where you have two kings. One, and they're both Assyrian. One is the king of Assyria, Esarhaddon, and the other is his brother in Babylon. They make war against each other. You have many examples. You look at the family of Artaxerxes. Both Artaxerxes and his wife died on the same day. Find that curious, don't you? Do you know what the favorite vehicle was for assassinating a king in the ancient world? Poison, absolutely. And you almost wonder if that's what's going on there. So, the king that follows him to the throne will rule for 45 days. He's going to be assassinated by his half-brother. They're going to put then, that half-brother's going to reign for 6 months, and he's going to be assassinated by two other half-brothers and his sister. Artaxerxes had one son to the queen, 17 sons to concubines. That happens all over the ancient Near East. So you always have the potential of someone saying, I'm going to remove you and take your place. When Sennacherib comes back from making war on the Jews, remember when he lays siege to Jerusalem and he comes back to Assyria? He is assassinated while he's in the temple praying to his God. Guess who assassinates him? Two of his sons. It is the eldest son who had been the crown prince but was removed in favor of a younger son with another son. So you see that happening all over the ancient world. Remember the story of Herod. What happened to Herod's wife, Mariamne? He killed her. Why? He was afraid that she was conspiring to take his throne. He kills his own sons. So this kind of thing in the ancient Near East happens all the time. And when you have multiple sons to multiple different mothers, you have the potential for instability and you have the potential for a problem. And that's exactly what happens. So the decree was to maintain both the majesty and safety of king. There is no other reference to this custom, but it's consistent with Oriental practices. Kings are always concerned about their safety because of plots to remove them. Herodotus refers to this. He says, those who sought an interview with the king had to be announced. Okay? Josephus refers to this law that's mentioned to suggest that none of the king's own people, including members of his own family, should approach him unsummoned when he sat on the throne. It says it this way, there's one law, there's no exception. The pronoun here refers to the lawbreaker. The lawbreaker would face the penalty of death. Okay, that brings us to chapter 5. Esther receives the king's favor to approach him. She asked the king and Haman to attend a banquet that she's sponsoring. Haman boasts to his family about the honors and riches he's received. Haman's wife suggested they build a gallows for which they could hang Mordecai on. On the third day, after this time of prayer and fasting, Esther puts on her royal robes of authority as queen, and she stood in the inner court in the king's palace. The king was sitting on a throne opposite to the entrance to the palace. He held out his scepter for Esther to approach. What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? I want you to notice her answer. Here's her answer. If it pleases the king, what does that suggest to you? There's a level of respect there, okay? If it pleases the king, this gives the proper deference and respect that the king's office deserves. The king was pleased with Esther, which is seen in his response in verse 6. What is it you wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled. Now, that reminds me of another Bible story where someone promises a half a kingdom. What's that story? Herod and his stepdaughter, Herodian, her dance, and he promised probably in drunkenness. He promised, I'll give you up to half the kingdom. What does she want? John the Baptist's head. Yeah, okay. Okay. Her response is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request. Now, how does Haman interpret this invitation to the banquet? Haman's all filled up with personal pride. What? Yeah, he really thinks he's hot stuff. He looks at all the honors he's received. He's prime minister. Surely this is going to be to honor me. He misinterprets things, but he looks at it from a selfish standpoint. He's full of self-pride. Haman's wife, Zeresh, and her friends proposed the idea of preparing a gallows for Mordecai, which is 50 cubits. Do you know how tall 50 cubits is? 73.9 feet. That's a pretty tall gallows. You know, even if Mordecai is 6 foot, that's plenty big enough to do the job, okay? Chapter 6. The king has a sleepless night and discovers that Mordecai has saved his life. The king reveals to Haman that he wishes to honor someone. When he tells Haman that he wants to honor someone, what is Haman going to think? He's going to honor me. Yeah. So he's going to ask for all kind of stuff, all right? I love the story. Okay, so Xerxes is suffering from insomnia. Relaxing him sleep won't help. Why is this a pivotal moment in the narrative of the story? This is a classic example of God's providence. It is not coincidental that the king doesn't sleep. God is working behind the scenes as he's always working behind the scenes. The same God who can speak to men through dreams can also give men sweet sleep or restless nights. Psalm 4:8 says, in peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. Proverbs 19:23, the fear of the Lord leads to life, and whoever has it rests satisfied. He will not be visited by harm. And then Proverbs 3:24, if you lie down, you will not be afraid when you lie down. Your sleep will be sweet. Okay? Now it mentions the book of memorable deeds. You know what the book of memorable deeds is? It is the same kind of chronicles you'll find in every empire. It's going to have in it all the royal decrees that have been made. So if you want to look through history, you look through this book of deeds, this chronicle. The king reviews the records, and it shows that earlier Mordecai had revealed a plot against the king's life. You read about that in Esther 2:21 through 23. The act of reading the chronicle, again, is part of the turning point of the story. The king asks, how was Mordecai honored? And the answer was, he wasn't. Nothing was done for him. So Haman, again, mistakenly thinks the king's going to honor him. The king says, how should we honor someone like this? And what does Haman say? Well, here's what you need to do. Let royal robes be bought, which the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head should be a royal crown is set, and let the robes and the horse be handed over to the one who the king's most noble officials. Let them dress a man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. So Haman is really setting it up to be honored. Only it doesn't work out quite that way for him. And that brings us to chapter 7. At the banquet, Queen Esther reveals that she's a Jew, and that she, like her people, are scheduled to be killed. She also reveals that the man behind the plot to commit mass murder is none other than Haman. The king leaves the banquet to consider what is happening. He's full of wrath because of what he's heard. Haman realizes that he's doomed, and he begs for mercy from Esther. And when the king comes back in, he finds Haman leaning over on her couch, begging to protect himself, and the king thinks that he's assaulting Esther, okay? So he's going to take care of the problem. Again, in verse 3, you read, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if I please the king, let my life be granted to me for my wish and my people. And then she reveals the plot and the man who's behind it, Haman. The king asked, who dared to do this? And answered, a foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman. Haman's plot's been exposed, and he is terrified at this point because he knows that he's prepared a gallows to hang Mordecai, and he's going to discover he's going to hang from that gallows. Chapter 8. Esther requests the king help her in nullifying the edict that doomed the Jews. The king is unable to rescind the edict, but allows Mordecai to write a letter to the governors of the provinces. There's 30 provinces at this time. The letter that Mordecai writes allows the Jews to defend themselves and even to kill those who seek to fulfill the king's original decree. Now, there's some misunderstanding that once a king has written an edict or law, it cannot be overturned. What they do is they write a new law that goes around it. So he doesn't have to overturn the old law because he's going to allow the Jews to defend themselves, and that takes care of the problem. So the king summons his scribes to address the problem. The Persian kings were known for issuing edicts that held extraordinary legal force, and at times they would issue edicts that really seemed to come in conflict, but they were able to resolve it. So one of the things that we see about the Persian Empire is that it had a very efficient bureaucracy with a centralized form of power, but a decentralized form of administration. They had a very effective administrative system. They had something that was called the Royal Road, and the Royal Road went from Sardis in Asia Minor to Susa in modern Iran. It went for about 1,553 miles. And so they were able to send couriers from one part of the kingdom to another very rapidly, almost like Pony Express operated. That's the way they could do it. So it wasn't really a problem to get out this new message of how the Jews were supposed to be handled. So Esther asked for permission for the Jews to defend themselves. The king grants that. Haman's edict still had 9 months before it was going to go into effect. Esther had plenty of time to protect the Jews. Chapter 9. The Jews throughout the empire successfully defend themselves against their enemies. Even Persian officials helped the Jews. Haman's 10 sons are hanged. Another letter is sent to the Persian provinces, commanding Adar 14th, starting on sunset of the 13th, be called Purim, to be celebrated to remember the Jews being spared from destruction. Does anybody know what the word Purim means? It means lots. And it refers to the selection of the day when Haman's edict would go into effect against the Jews. It was done by lot. Okay? So, all the officials of the kingdom helped the Jews. Mordecai grew more and more powerful. The Jews destroyed 500 men who were their enemies. The 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews defended themselves against their enemies, and 75,000 of their enemies were killed. 75,000. Did you catch that? Purim then celebrates the miraculous delivery of the Jews from the hands of the enemies. The idea in verse 28 was that these days should be remembered throughout every generation, in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim would the people would never fail to recognize what God had done in delivering them. There's a problem with that. This is not the first time that we see God telling the Jews to remember his actions and not forget. And every time what happens, they forget. Okay? Chapter 10. King Xerxes imposed a tax on the land and the coastlands to the seas, and that's what kings do at their best, is impose taxes and collect them. There's another name for a tax. It's called tribute, and that's how the Persians run their efficient administration. And all the acts of his power and might and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai. Mordecai was second in rank to the king. Monarchs in ancient Near East were considered to be owners of the land in their realms, with final authority over subjects and subject property. At the same time, they had certain responsibilities. They were expected to ensure order in the kingdom and justice for their subjects. Kings were understood to be defenders of their domain. The king had a special relationship with their national gods. The trappings of the king included royal residence, crown, throne, and that scepter that I've referred to. Kings communicated with each other by addressing kings in the ancient Near East. I find this fascinating. The way they would communicate is if the king of Persia wanted to talk to the Pharaoh of Egypt, he would write to him as my brother. Or if he's going to write to the king of Babylon, he would refer to him as my brother, or the Hittite king, and they would respond in the same way. So Mordecai then rises to second command of Persia. He was the vizier, or he's the prime minister. This would be the chief advisor of the king, but he also had certain administrative responsibilities. So that's kind of the story of Esther in a nutshell. Went through it real quick. Any questions? What we see is the providence of God. Is God still active in human history today? When we see things taking place that seem unjust and we don't like it, we need to realize that God is moving in human history even today, even in things we don't like. Okay? So we need to put our trust in God, not in government. We need to put our trust in God, not kings. God is faithful and just, and he will always do what is right. Men at times fail us. God never fails us. Esther teaches that. God operates in providence. There's no other questions or comments. We'll have a word of prayer, and I'll dismiss you. Okay? I do want to say this. The young couple that we prayed for, Marion and Corbin, I did their wedding about a year ago, I guess. This was their first baby. They tried to induce delivery. She couldn't do it. They finally took the baby by C-section. I think it was around 4:30 yesterday. And by maybe a little after 6, the baby passed. So the whole family, we had a chance to see the baby while the baby was still alive.